evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the Arriscraft lecture titled Caretaking. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd first like to spend a moment to acknowledge Indigenous lands, waters, and peoples of the territory that the University of Waterloo occupies. While we are all connecting from across the world, from territories each with their own histories and stories, I am calling in from Cambridge, Ontario, which is situated on the Haldimand Tract, a swath of land 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. This land was promised to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River and is within the territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. As an aspiring architect, it is important for me to acknowledge that this practice takes place on sites of displacement and on unceded territories and land. Embedded within the practice of design itself are colonial tools, such as surveying and measured drawing, which have enabled and continue to enable the appropriation of Indigenous land and ways of life, lending to a culture of spatial inequality. Today, we are here discussing the role of caretaking, a term deeply tied to Western society and politics and devalued by colonialism. Berenice Fisher defines caretaking as deciding to take on the responsibility of care, a term we greatly need to understand if we are to meaningfully restore our relationship to the earth, happening in solidarity with the ongoing work of land protectors and centering the resurgence of Indigenous knowledge and voices. I would like to take a moment to thank the committee, Tara Bissett, Adrian Blackwell, Julie Dring, Jaliya Fonseka, Marie-Paule Macdonald, Mayuri Paranthahan, Brenda Reid, Beth Wendy Yuan, and Yuan. And thank you again for the Arriscraft funding and support. I would like to pass it on to Anne.
Thank you, Ali. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A few weeks ago, I had the honor of introducing the lecture series and say a few words about Andrew Levitt, a recently retired emeritus professor, a longtime lecturer, and unwaveringly caring mentor, friend, advisor, teacher to so many of us. Tonight, I'm here with a heavy heart to share the sad news that Andrew passed away early on Sunday morning after a short illness. He died peacefully at home, surrounded by love. We had dedicated the lecture series to Andrew to honor a legacy of a School of Architecture teacher who had forever been centering his work around care. We had hoped for Andrew's presence and his teaching to have a place in the series of lectures that we will host over the next 18 months. But now this dedication is not only in honor of Andrew Levitt, but also in his memory. For those of you who may not have had the privilege to know Andrew, to read him or to hear him speak, I'll just say a few words. One of the reasons this series on care is dedicated to him is to recognize how deeply rooted in Andrew's way of teaching and being was, how deeply rooted in care. He wrote 2 books, The Inner Studio and Listening to Design, and each in their own ways, these books were opening students to the thoughts of caring for the invisible, for what is not present, caring for emotions, for an idea, caring for others, but also for themselves. He always spoke to the full human being, their skills and their souls, their strengths and their fears. It's actually quite stunning to hear former students and colleagues share their appreciation of Andrew. Everyone recognizes his humility, his unwavering guidance, the very present presence, and having just the words, the advice, the reading recommendation for a bad day, a blank page, or a frustrating drawing, an apparent impasse. He was there for everyone. He had amazing integrity, great empathy. So Andrew's thoughtful advice, his kind mentoring, and his caring presence was really like a compass orienting so many students, colleagues, friends, and the school really in fundamental ways. We will dedicate one of the upcoming events in this series to his teachings and writings. Just how and when is not clear. not just yet, but we'll send details when those are ready. So tonight, I don't want to say much more, but I would like to hold a minute of silence, to hold Andrew in our thoughts, and perhaps most meaningfully for those of us here who knew Andrew. So thank you, everyone. I'm not sure how much more I want to say here now in this venue, but I really wanted to make sure you heard at least something about this man and thinker who quietly but unrelentingly put care in the center of his work and his teaching. And I guess with some of this gravitas now, I will leave it to Fiona to introduce our speakers. But let me first say a few words about her as the to introduce her as the moderator for the evening as well. So Fiona Kenney is a PhD student in architecture at McGill University. She's supervised by Professor Annmarie Adams. Her research examines spatial expressions of care with a focus on palliative care environments. She investigates how care, as an amorphous and often unstable concept, has been imagined and embodied through medical environments purposely designed to house care work. Fiona holds MDes in History and Philosophy of Design from Harvard University and is a 2021-2022 graduate fellow at the McGill Institute for Health and Social Policy. Her work is supported by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Friends of CAMH Archives, and McGill University. So thank you all again for being here tonight. Greetings to David and Annmarie as well. And now to Fiona.
Thank you so much, Anne and Ali and the events committee. I'll speak for the three of us. We're honored to be here tonight. So I'm happy to be introducing our two speakers for today, also both from the McGill School of Architecture. Professors Annmarie Adams and David Theodore have worked together for almost 30 years and have written articles and worked on funded projects together, often on the topic of hospital architecture. They bring complementary expertise to the subject. They both initially trained as architects, but then focused on research, Annmarie at UC Berkeley and David at Harvard. Annmarie's research focuses on the intersections of medicine, gender, and architecture, and she's currently writing a spatial biography of Canadian cardiologist Maud Abbott. In recent years, she's shifted her teaching to med students. And David's work explores the history and theory of computation in the organization and management of institutions like hospitals, and he's currently Canada Research Chair in Architecture, Health, and Computation. David's also an active design critic, jurist, and even Canada's Biennale co-curator. And Annmarie and David have also each served as director of the School of Architecture. So Annmarie from 2011 to 2015, and David currently as of September 2021. The three of us have also each just had pieces published in eFlux Architecture in a series called Treatment on the topic of care and architecture, but more on this later. So hi again, Annmarie and David.
Hi, Fiona. Hi, Anne. Thanks for the introduction, Anne, too.
Very sorry for the loss of your colleague.
So for this discussion, we've pictured a really informal conversation structured in three parts. So we're going to start with architectural education broadly, hospitals, and then writing and research, and all, of course, as they relate to the concept of care. And we really want to encourage any audience members to pop questions in the chat as we go, and I will do my best to keep one eye on those and interject with them throughout. But we will also have a dedicated moment for Q&A at the end. So to kick things off, when asked for a title for our discussion today, we chose Caretaking, as you all know. And I wanted to ask, why did we choose this as our starting point? And maybe David, as current director, we can start with you.
That is a kind of privilege. Thanks, Fiona. Names are fun. So choosing the name was already starting to think about what care means. And one of the things with the word care is just how many different things it can mean, even if you just put a preposition with it, care of, care for, it just changes. There's even this way that if you just say take care, that can say goodbye, like say, get out of here. It doesn't necessarily mean something positive. And caretaking versus taking care was one of the kinds of considerations. So just the way that the word, the concept already had a bunch of play and a bunch of concepts all together jumbled up in it. Caretaking, we need to take care of the word care itself as well.
Well, I liked caretaking because it's the gerund, caretaking, to emphasize it as ongoing, that it's current, that we're in it now, it's happening. And mostly, Fiona, I've learned about care and paid attention to it more carefully since you arrived in the PhD program a year ago to do your thesis. Learned so much about care from you. And thanks to you, I see it everywhere. So it's like that psychological condition where you learn a new word and you see it everywhere. And as you know, I'm constantly sending you things I see on social media about care, but I feel like that's why I wanted the ing, because we're living it.
But we could have said taking care of business, like Bachman Turner Overdrive. We could have had a theme song.
We could have.
Yes.
But then what does, so, you know, taking care, caretaking, what does care look like in an educational context? We've talked about how the three of us, we've talked about how architecture school can, you know, is notoriously uncaring in some ways. And so what does it look like to take care of each other in an educational context? What does care look like at architecture school? And, you know, how has this changed in the last 2 years, you know, during the pandemic, or even, you know, before that? Let's start with Annmarie this time. Yep.
Well, it's my opinion that architectural education is desperately in need of care and carers. So I welcome the caring term. And of course, the studio, the competitive environment of the studio, the kind of bravado of who can stay up the longest, and the penchant for procrastination, the constantly moving deadlines, I think it's had really crippling results in the profession and in the lives of architects. Plus, I think the situation really devalues our work. And so happily, David Theodore has made significant changes in our school already in the 2.5 months that he's been director, closing studio at night, for example, at 8 p.m. I think it's a fantastic move. And one of those opportunities that I think COVID enabled. But so I guess to me, care is a kind of critique of our system rather than a solution. And that's one of the reasons that it feels so active and so exciting.
It's true that I think the studio culture has to change, if only because of what we're doing right now on Zoom. That means you can do lots of different things with different people in studio. You don't all have to be in the same room, and you certainly don't all have to be there at 4 a.m. Making espresso, burning each other. But on the other hand, I still would say that care is a very flexible word at this moment. So my example is always that we used to have the University of Excellence. So everything used to be excellent. We had centers of excellence at universities, and you chose professors because they were excellent and so on. And it just really becomes a word that can mean a lot of different things rather than serve as critique or as solution. It just can serve as both. So we're still in the tail end of the research university, where everything that we do is research. You know, if we teach a class, that's research, and the students go off to research, and then after that we do research. So it would be an interesting move if, especially with the things of the pandemic, do shift architectural education to thinking about care. How do we take care of our students as opposed to how do we educate them? You know, how do we get them to think like us, which is the old idea of education, and maybe more like a nurturing or something like that they give them space to do something rather than fill them up with knowledge so they become excellent. It's a moment where that might be possible. And care might be the concept that allows us to think it through.
Mhm. Well, so then if it means anything, or if it means different things in different contexts, a lot of different things, then what is architecture for care? We had a conversation about this, and I think there was some, not disagreement, but definitely like, what does architecture for care mean to each of you? It means something to me, as Anne's introduction of me kind of alluded to, but what does that mean to each of you, David?
Well, Fiona, why don't you just say 2 words about it, what it means to you first, just quick.
Well, I'm specifically looking at, I'm thinking of medical environments that have care as a mission rather than explicitly cure. So, you know, again, Anne's introduction, I am interested in the purpose-built residential hospice, which, of course, the mandate of hospice care, this is more than 2 words. The mandate of hospice care runs counter to the medical desire to cure. So I'm interested in those spaces. So I guess that's what it means to me, and then throw it back to you.
Well, I have an example where care partly has to do with, say, maintenance rather than program. At McGill, we had a slate of post-war buildings with curtain walls that have a rain screen curtain wall. So any water that gets on the facade is supposed to go behind the facade and then go out through some kind of distribution system back into the real world. And there was a decade or so when the maintenance of those buildings, they glued them up. They just didn't realize that the weep holes were for the water to get out. So then for a long time, the water gets trapped behind the curtain wall rather than going through. So that's a kind of care. You need to care for buildings. You need to, honor the building in a certain kind of way and for it to have a life that continues and so on. So that's not related to the activity that's going on in the architecture. That's more about it's not the architect who's responsible for that care, if I can put it like that, but it's still an architecture related question about care. I just think there are lots of them. But Annmarie, do you know what I'm talking about with the curtain walls at McGill?
Yeah, yes, of course. Yeah, I do. Absolutely. But I guess my approach to what architecture for care is, as somebody who's spent my whole career working on the caring buildings of houses and hospitals, are typologies that are purposefully designed to care in special ways for their users. So very different than what you're talking about. But, something that is not always the most stylish, most fashionable thesis project or research topic in schools of architecture. And that's why it's particularly exciting or heartening to see it becoming more popular.
Mm-hmm.
But Andrew, would you say that I'm specifically thinking of the domestic environment, would you say that those architectures are designed to care for the user, or are they designed to house care work, or is that different? Maybe it's not different.
Yeah, well, both the ways that I've written about houses in my book, Architecture in the Family Way, and in the book on hospitals, Medicine by Design, were both about how the architecture shaped the activities and lives and cultures within the building. I have real discomfort with this idea that architecture is responsive to these factors.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, Architecture in the Family Way was all about that, about the sort of triad of women, doctors, and houses, and the house as the kind of knowledge system for women. But I think it's a super interesting question about whether the feminization of the profession of architecture or the architecture school since 1980, for example, at McGill, we've had more than 50% women students, whether that has any kind of connection to the rise of care, or whether that's even a sexist assumption now. Anyway, I think somehow they're tied up together.
Well, there's got to be, to some degree, where the ethics of care that comes out of feminist thinking has made its way into architectural thinking. But it's one of those questions, I'm still wondering, one of the things with healthcare is one of the reasons our system is so similar to the US, even though sometimes we pretend it's not, but it's very, very closely in terms of how much we spend and so on and so forth, health outcomes. And one of the reasons is, like the US, we have very, very few doctors per 1,000 of population. We have a low concentration of doctors. I think France has twice as many doctors per population as we do. And it's that question, do we have too many architects in order to take care of something? And then we need the influx of other people other than the people who were architects 50 years ago? Or should we be trying to double it even more? So rather than simply adding more students, changing the demographics of the students that we have, we would change it by doubling the amount of students we would have, let's say. So the school would simply be more representative population-wise or something, but not by we would replace the people who are there right now, but we would just simply grow and then have more architects running around, doing architecture. Would that be good? Would that be something that schools should be doing? Would that be careful?
No, I actually think that would be careless. And we have to be very careful in the number of students we take, since employment can be challenging. But anyway, that's a bit.
Well, but that's the question. It's in France, doctors make less than they do in the US. So that's the scarcity of the profession is what drives up the price of them. And you could make, that's the thing, is where do you want to, so if there's a change that there's more women and fewer of them, it's still the same rate of uptake as actual professionals, which is, as far as I can tell, it is. In other words, we have more women students, we don't have more women registered architects. Is that not correct? So
yes, there's a drastic difference.
Yeah, so how do we remedy that? How do we cure that? That's what I mean. Is it something like, would we have more buildings that have the kinds of activities you were just talking about, the kinds of people in them, if we had simply more architects representing them? In other words, is it not just a fight for scarcity that's controlling what the thesis projects are, the final projects, or the things that get studied and published in the journals and so on? I find that one a fascinating one.
Mm-hmm.
But so why are the buildings for care so understudied?
Are you asking me that now? Or now we're switching roles?
Well, I think Annmarie, you maybe kind of just answered, or maybe it's because I know I'm assuming what your answer is, but yeah, I mean, do you want to just tell us why buildings for care are so understudied as you see it?
Well, I think they're more studied now, but in the past, I think they were understudied because they were kind of seen as weak, programmatically weak and unimportant, because the users of them were old people or women or children or non-white people. And hopefully all that is changing. And I guess one of the silver linings for me of COVID is the new focus on long-term care as a serious design problem. It's always been like the lowest rung of the architectural food chain for firms, and in terms of budgets and just in terms of care, architectural care. And that had disastrous consequences. And I really think that the profession needs to put a new focus on long-term care post-COVID. So maybe with prizes or scholarships or just whatever it can do to add some prestige and visibility to the problem of long-term care.
Mm-hmm. I think that's, David, unless you have something you wanted to add to that, I think that's actually a good place to start with our second sort of topic here. So we'll move on to hospitals. The two of you have written a handful of papers together on children's hospitals, chest hospitals, high-rise medical clinics, the failure of modern hospital design, and most recently, the relation of cities and hospitals, along with your heritage assessment of the now abandoned RVH, the Royal Victoria Hospital here in Montreal. So David, your article in the treatment issue of Efflux Architecture presents a bunch of questions as to the usefulness of and sort of limits to care with respect to hospital architecture. And so I will link the 3 articles in that series in the chat here while you sort of present yours to get us started talking about hospitals. And I will throw up your slides here. How's that?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm just going to take a second to read a set piece about what I've called the change from care to cure and back again. In other words, the historical change from hospitals that were about care to hospitals that were about cure, and our more recent change back to this idea of care. And then I'll go through the slides and just say what they are. So just read this paragraph first. When scholars first charted the 19th century invention of the modern hospital around a half century ago, they posited a change, a shift from care to cure. Hospitals transformed from charitable institutions caring for the sick poor to institutions devoted to the cure of diseases through clinical science accessible to all citizens. So in the 19th century, the hospital was an institution of care. The modern hospital was dedicated to cure. So the heyday of this curing hospital was roughly the age of flight. That is, from the Wright brothers to the moon landing. In that area, hospitals cared less and cured more. One of the ones is simply moving long-term care out of the hospital into other kinds of institutions, as Annmarie just mentioned. That happened over the course of the 20th century, though really got a kickstart at the beginning. And hospital architecture changed and sort of, as Annmarie was just trying to say, it just didn't merely reflect this change. It was kind of produced by it and produced and reinforced and accelerated it. So you unlink the hospital from social ideas such as poverty or loneliness or charity or religion, and especially community, and connect it to medical science in universities. And today we simply want to switch that back and imagine again what hospitals that are caring might look like. So just a couple of examples to illustrate this argument. This is from the book that Michel Foucault and colleagues wrote about the healing machine, La Machine à Guérir, and it's a section of a proposal for a hospital 1774. So why it's useful is in this argument is because under that huge dome at the very bottom is an altar. So the whole organization of the hospital was around this religious idea about caring for the sick poor. So all of those cells off to the side would be places for the sick poor to be healed in relation to this notion of charity and religion. So want to flip it, Fiona?
Yep.
So this is what Fiona just talked about, the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, just before its official opening. And it was 1892 is just at that moment where hospitals changed from care to cure. So it was originally opened by rich donors. It was an active charity for the sick poor in Montreal. But almost upon opening day, it switched to this function of cure, medical science. It opened surgery became popular there, an important part of the hospital worked, and a connection to a university, which we'll see in a second. So maybe the next one, Fiona. So I really love this drawing of the so-called drive-in hospital. This is a university hospital at the University of Cologne in 1965. And the idea of the drive-in hospital was not that you would have your surgery in your car, but still that the care would be speedy and efficient, like buying a cheeseburger at a drive-in restaurant. And that idea that you didn't need to be cared for in the hospital, you simply needed to be cured. I don't think you could have a better illustration of how that might work. And then the next one is Stony Brook. So this is that idea of where did that cure come from? Well, it came from medical science and a deep connection to the kinds of progress that was going on in the university. So on the left here, you have the hospital tower, and then it's literally connected in as visually clearly a way as possible to the clinical science tower and the basic science tower. So this whole idea that your life in the hospital had nothing to do with whether you were poor or sick, it was about curing you. And then one last one. So this is the heart and lung clinic at St. Olas Hospital in Trondheim, where the whole idea of the patient experience at the hospital is based around what's usually called family-centered care this way, but these days, but that as you go through the hospital, it's important that you get cared for and not simply cured. So this bear is a piece of art. They have an amazing collection of modern art that's in the hospital there. So it's not exactly showing the care going on, but the idea that you need this kind of playfulness, this kind of artwork in order to have a good hospital, I think you can see contrast greatly with the last one, where it was all about science and cure. So that's the move back. This is my symbol, my illustration of the move back to care in hospital design.
Sorry, I'm multitasking here. I'm going to put those links in the chat now. But I guess coming off of our last question before your presentation, David, why do so few architectural historians study hospitals? And along the same vein, why are so few hospitals in the so-called architectural canon? I will give that one to Annmarie first, actually.
Okay, well, I think that it's quite remarkable that so few hospitals are in the canon. I think really only Alvar Aalto's Paimio would maybe count as on the list of greatest hits of the 20th century. And that is mostly because Siegfried Gideon included the hospital as the best illustration of functionalism in his space-time and architecture. So being included in a popular textbook like that is a good measure of being in the canon. And I think the explanation lies in the rise of the modern hospital as a kind of technological machine, that architects justifying the specialization within the profession have for decades suggested that that hospitals were so complicated that they really required this special knowledge. Airports are kind of the same. And so there was this sort of disconnect that hospitals are really distinct from mainstream culture and that they're very complicated and kind of scientific, and sort of that they are driven by different factors. And I don't believe that at all. So I think the rise of care is going to see many more hospitals included as historical subjects. I mean, when I started working on hospitals, there was just a handful of architectural historians, and now there's 2 handfuls. I mean, it's still a very small group, but it's doubled definitely. And, you know, PhD subjects like yours are good evidence of the rise too.
Yeah, I would agree with, especially with that last point. So I have a kind of question about how hospitals are being studied, in that we've really tapped the same sources, and this care to cure and cure to care story has been driven a lot of the research. And there are other ways to look at hospitals. So there's some people have looked at British hospitals architecture from a kind of financial, economic driven model. That's really changing which hospitals that you look at and which ones you don't. I think a little bit still the questions of so, for example, in hospitals, there's a lot of robots running around. A hospital for a long time has had a kind of underground service area, then the entrance level, and then at a +1 level, you would have where the visitors move around, let's say. And that's meant a lot of things about the digital inside of the hospital. So not in the hospital becomes a kind of digital project, as opposed to formal project, let's put it. You have to get the information systems right, otherwise you have a bad hospital. And that again opens that door for cure. If it's robots doing everything, that doesn't sound, sorry, for care. If it's robots doing all the work, that doesn't sound like a very caring hospital. So there's a lot of energy into still the same ideas, but we can study them differently. So atriums, healing gardens, natural light, sunlight, how the family gets taken care of as opposed to how the doctors do their job well, all those kinds of things. So there's a lot to study with hospitals that is not quite exactly the Gideon questions anymore. How does whiteness become or clean lines or something that comes from the clean lines of medical? I mean, that's true to some degree, but it just doesn't have the force that some of the questions that are coming along with the ethics of care allow us to look at other things, economics, how it fits into the city. There's very little actually about how hospitals and their communities and neighborhoods work, which was a huge topic, but we haven't studied it. So we just kind of, I'm wondering, as we're speaking, if I even have a mental image of a hospital in Waterloo. I don't know. Anyway.
Well, while you're thinking about that, Fiona, why don't you tell us a little bit about your PhD dissertation on care and architecture and what roles hospitals might play in that research?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of going off of what I mentioned earlier, I'm just interested in this sort of cross typological study of architectures under this broad umbrella of care architectures, I guess, which, like I say, I'm sort of defining as or approaching as those healthcare environments with a mandate of care, more explicitly than a mandate of cure, and like I say, the best example is the purpose-built residential hospice. And I wonder sort of how that difference in mandate has played out in space. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's Jenks who says that the hospice is a non-type. Yeah, right? Yeah. So, like as an architecture described through sort of a negative brief. So it's a hospital that's not a hospital, or like it's not this and this and this, and so whatever you're left with once you carve out those things is the hospice. So it's this in limbo between a hospital, a home, sometimes a church, sometimes a community center. I just think it's a really unique sort of to group everything together under this umbrella term as care architecture. I find that really fascinating. And Annmarie, I know you, of course, have often argued that architecture shouldn't be studied in isolation, that hospitals shouldn't be studied in isolation, but as linked to these other typologies. And why do you see it that way?
Well, I see, back to what I said before, I think a way of connecting hospitals to a larger architectural history is is to link it to these other building types. But I guess one of the reasons is this idea that I really believe in, that hospitals have always looked like something else. Like David showed the Royal Vic, and it looks like an old Scottish castle. And we all know that hospitals now look like hotels or spas or airports or shopping centers. And I really believe that that kind of associationism, that triggering of the hospital looking like something else, has been a way that architects and doctors together have kind of camouflaged or softened the impact of serious illness. It's one of the things I wrote about in the eFlux trio of papers. I was on dementia villages with film historian Sally Shivers, and we used websites as websites for dementia villages for models because they're so hard to visit. But I think in an illness like dementia, like Alzheimer's, that has no cure, that's when we really see architects reverting to a very kind of conservative design mode, in this case, the village, as a kind of comforting environment, as a kind of trope of comfort. Just like Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto that David and I have studied looks like the Eaton Center. It means that when you go to Sick Kids for your cancer treatment, subconsciously it feels like going to the mall. So it makes it easier. Or you could argue that it's a form of architectural denial, but it definitely has it shifts the way you experience the building. And I think that's really fundamental to hospital design.
Mm-hmm. And you've also written about how it's that sort of camouflaging relies on assumes a very specific perspective or experience, right? How domestic sort of cues assume a kind of middle class, traditional perspective. So yeah, I think that's also important too. It's about how difficult it is when the notion of home or sort of domesticity means so many different things to people, of like, how do you create a caring environment when that looks differently to different people, right?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things David and I discovered on a big research project a few years ago on sick kids, where we gave the young patients disposable cameras and tried to capture their experience of the atrium. And we quickly realized through the photos and through interviews how differently each of them connected the way the atrium looked to another place. You know, everything from Florida condos to suburban malls, all sorts of fantasy environments too. And many of them took photos looking outside, so it felt very prison-like to some of them.
Yeah, there was one that found the only tree that you could see from their floor and took a photo of that one. They were fun, those guys. I wanted to add though, there's an essay about hospitals that I've never written that I kind of call War on Sleep. So when I was doing research for Annmarie years ago, I discovered this thing at Queens, I believe, the hospital at Queens. So in the 1930s, they for the first time had a manager of the hospital who came from business school rather than being simply a doctor who was in charge. And one of the first things he did was start making patients leave the hospital. Any patient who had been there for longer than 8 months or some number like that, he said must leave the hospital now. So it's that thing. It used to be normal to be in a hospital for a long time. We think of it, oh no, hospitals are where you just go quickly, but that's a war on sleep is maybe too long. But all sorts of people used to sleep at the hospital, and the nurses used to live there, and we've removed them from the hospital. The interns used to live there, we've removed them from the hospital. So the idea of long-term care or being cared for in the hospital is literally connected to domesticity. It's not just that it looks that way. People used to live there. Carla Yanni, who's a architectural historian, writes about mental asylums in the 19th century in the same way, that the asylums, which might have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 patients, were long-term care for most people. Those people who were in the asylums in the 19th century are now in long-term care homes. They weren't there because of particular mental health problems. It was called a mental asylum, but it was where people in society who needed long-term care went. And same with hospitals. And it's really taken a lot of effort by hospitals to get rid of that part of domesticity, that part that people are living there. And you can just imagine that if you're a nurse living there, your sense of your relationship to the architecture is very different than if you take the metro there or drive your car to this big parking lot and go to work that way. I think we underestimate that kind of cultural change too.
I don't know if I can just spontaneously add something about US and Canadian hospitals with that regard, because this is something that, well, David and I have talked with Professor David Sloan at the University of Southern California for years about. He and Beverly Conant Sloan wrote this great book, Medicine Moves to the Mall. Anyway, American and Canadian hospitals since 1980. There it is.
I was just reading it today.
It was going to be called The Mauling of America, which was really good. No, The Mauling of Healthcare or something. Sorry.
Anyway, American and Canadian hospitals look a lot alike. You know, they look like luxury hotels, which is super interesting because our healthcare systems are so different. But American hospitals have to compete with each other for patients. Like they have to offer, you know, better valet parking or better whatever luxuries to bring their paying patients to satisfy the, you know, profit-driven economy of hospital culture in the US. And our system is the opposite. I mean, our buildings should repel patients because we want patients to stay as short a time as possible in the hospital. Like when my mother had her 3 kids, she stayed for 10 days in the hospital. She always said what a great rest that was. And when I had my 2 kids, you know, I was lucky if I could stay overnight. So within one generation, it's really changed. And I think the reason Canadian hospitals look like American hospitals is the reason that so much of Canadian culture looks like US culture, that our expectations of what a hospital looks like are shaped by, you know, those images in magazines and movies and architectural magazines. But of course, the nursing ratios, all sorts of things are different. The budgets are hugely different. And so Canadian hospitals have suffered from that expectation. So the McGill University Health Center basically looks like, many people think it looks like a Toys R Us with all its different colored pavilions. Well, so maybe that repels people. Maybe that one works in the high price of parking. But in any case, something is happening there. Our hospitals should look more like Swedish hospitals, and they don't.
But for both of you, there's a question in the chat that follows on from that. What should long-term residential care centers look like? So should they look like Toys R Us?
Well, I've been asked this a lot over COVID, and I actually don't think they should look like houses. And I don't think hospitals are more comforting if they look domestic. So I guess because I'm a modernist at heart, I really believe design should be truthful and that these buildings should look like institutions and that they can be well-designed institutions. But there still is this, just this crippling kind of assumption that that any building that looks like a home is somehow better. And you know, I've said this so many times that all institutions designed for women have pitched roofs. It's hard to find one that doesn't have a pitched roof. and that's a kind of hangover of domesticity. But I know that's very unpopular with many healthcare experts who think that rocking chairs and wallpaper and oak paneling makes people feel better.
Maybe we can
Hey,
also,
we're kind of off. We're off our plan.
well, I was also going to say, maybe we can, now that my one eye has been reoriented to the chat, maybe we can also address Julian's question from earlier as well. This may have been sent off, coming off of David, your presentation. So the question, how can spiritualism and sense of self reappear in a genuine way? Yeah, do either of you have an answer for that one?
I don't have an answer for that one. I do believe it's a cultural question, though. In other words, again, I think we underappreciate how different our culture is from just a few years ago. But like you were saying a second ago, Annmarie, I have a couple of examples from sick kids. Just trying to think of which one is clearest. But maybe it's this one. I interviewed the head of research at Sick Kids, and she told me because she had been on the design committee for the Zeidler extension to Sick Kids in 1993 as a nurse, and then had risen up through the ranks to become the head of research. And she told a story. Well, first she said, never let anybody decide colors, like never have that as an open discussion. As soon as you want to talk about colors, it's a fight. So don't do colors. And she said that one of the things about architecture and design and how you care for people that was striking to her was they had a situation in the outpatients where outpatients, young children were going to a particular procedure that was really painful, and the children in the waiting room could hear the kids screaming inside while they were getting the treatment. So it was a meeting with architects, can we move this away from the room or maybe put soundproofing in between? And in the meeting, someone said, well, why don't we just not cause pain to the kids so that they don't scream, right? That was the architectural solution, which is better than trying to put soundproofing in, was just not hurt the kids. And that's just simply a way that we've changed. If you went to the hospital as a child in the 1950s, you would be put in a room with, 4, 6, 8, 12 other children. And that was considered good because at home you were with 4, 6, 12, 8 other children. But if you put a kid today in a room with 4 other kids, they wouldn't know what to do because that's not how they live at home anymore. So the architecture, what counts as caring, what counts as taking care of someone, what counts as, I think the phrase in the question was sense of self. So for a child, right, it's just changed what the sense of self is. And those things can be physically done. You can put soundproofing in if you want, but you can also change what you're actually doing in a way that kind of changes the architecture. It just makes a difference to the architecture. So it's not just the architect who can change the architecture in that sense. It's the things that we do inside. And again, that's why care as a critique is a really, really useful concept there. We want to care differently, not just take care as if it's the same thing. If you take care of a child like you did in 1955, you're going to harm them in a way that you don't want to. Long answer, but.
Oh, that's a great example.
Let's, just in the interest of time, let's move to our third topic here. So we wanted to talk for a bit about writing and research. So we've talked about hospitals that you both have worked on, but what are you working on now, and how has the turn to care affected your writing or your work? So I'm going to, again, do my multitasking here.
Okay, so that's, I'm going to show some slides and answer that question just to change things up a little bit. So the turn to care, well, first I should say, since 2016, I've moved half my job to the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. So I've really stepped a little bit away from architectural education. I really just have PhD students in architecture, and I teach intro to architectural history. So I've tried to kind of reinvent myself as a historian of medicine. And so it's not so much that my topics have changed, because I was already writing about the most caring building types, I think, that you can imagine, that is houses and hospitals. But the turn to care has really affected my approach to writing. And so I'm writing a book, as Fiona mentioned in the introduction, of what I call a spatial biography of a pretty famous doctor, Maud Abbott. And the architectural angle of the book is that I'm narrating her life through, and there are many other biographies of her, I'm narrating her life through the spaces she inhabited or shaped. So this gives her, as the subject, a really active role in the kind of making of her own life story. And I think produces a really different narrative arc than the usual one of women's biography, where women face and defy all sorts of barriers. And so these books on the screen now are my inspiration. So these are really new and kind of material approaches to biography. And the Rebecca Solnit one I'm just reading right now and has just come out, and is particularly inspiring because I think it shows that you can write a feminist biography of a man through a plant. And and that's kind of what I'm trying to do with Maud Abbott. So maybe the next slide, Fiona, please. So the second project I wanted to bring up is the second point is that I'm doing some experimental writing, both in the book project on Maud Abbott and in a couple of chapters for other books, where I take into account my own feelings about the subject, almost as if I'm a user or a person in the architecture that I study. So this slide on the screen now does not represent it. So this represents what I've been doing for 30 years, these straight up traditional assessments, historical assessments of hospital spaces. So this is a pretty recent paper in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine on the Montreal Neurological Institute. So that's what I'm now working against, trying to do something else about the same building. So the next slide, please. So the most explicit example is this chapter I'm writing now about the lobby of the MNI, the Montreal Neurological Hospital, for a book collection called Feeling Disease, Experiencing Medicine and Illness in Modern History, edited by Rob Bottas and Bettina Hitzer, and coming out pretty soon. And so my piece for this book is in two voices. One, a very traditional, blah, blah architectural history voice. And the other is written in, will be published in italics. So the italic voice registers how I feel about what I'm saying in the other voice, how I feel about the archival documents, how I feel about the architecture, the stakeholders. So the next slide, please. If you know The Princess Bride, which is my daughter's favorite book, you will get exactly what I mean, because it's also written in two voices. And David Theodore's Feeling Foreign, What Happens When a Hospital Looks Just Like a Shopping Mall, it appeared in a CCA book, was also a fantastic inspiration for the project. So conceptually, I moved back and forth from the lobby to the archives to the lobby, figuring out, how does neurology feel? How can I communicate how it feels through words? How does my own sense of my body in the space, my age, my gender, my education, even my positionality, historian, and even my experience as a mother shape the way I understand the space? And I think this is really going to shape the final chapter of the Maud Abbott biography, which actually looks at the enslaved people in James McGill's household and Maud Abbott's relationship to them. So I think that's, there's one more slide. Oh, sorry, I should have said, and this is a drawing of me in a hotel room in Barcelona by my friend, very good friend, Professor Melissa Harris at the University of Michigan. Melissa and I traveled together for a year as students, and we drew each other in every hotel room we stayed in. So you see the plan and the picture of me on the bed drawing her. And I think this kind of this way that this special year I had studying architecture is finally kind of having an impact on the way that I'm coming to write.
How does it feel to write about, like, specifically a book chapter for, you know, an edited volume? How does it feel to write how you felt in those spaces? Because that's obviously very different from what we're taught to do.
Well, that's it. It's like going against everything I was trained to do. And I think it's taken a certain maturity. I mean, it's kind of almost humiliating to write some of it. You know, I write about what a bad speller Penfield is and how ridiculous that is. That such a famous brain surgeon can be such a bad speller. I take inspiration from it, from the work of several of our PhD students and from David's work. And in a way, it's just a new way to look at hospital space. But it's so liberating to think that, like, what I feel in the space matters as a historian.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really inspired in many ways by the writing about care, even though I didn't realize it.
Mm-hmm.
Is it writing as care as well? Are you?
Maybe.
Yeah. Self-care?
Yeah. I think you just come to a point, David. I don't know if you feel like that, but I feel like most of the things that I have to say about hospital architecture, I've said, even though there's so much more to say in it. So now I'm kind of turning a corner and revisiting spaces with this new sort of subjectivity.
I do often feel that I have trouble repeating myself in a certain way, and at the same time, some of these concepts need to be put in motion as well. I do like the idea, though, of biography and writing. Not so much. There's biographies of buildings these days as well, which is a weird. Weird kind of thing, as if buildings get born and live their lives and then they die eventually, right? Somehow. So we need long-term care for buildings or something. There's something about the act of writing in a world of care that is different than the act of writing in a world of research or a world of excellence. I just think that's true. I don't know, Fiona, do you care about your writing in that same way?
What am I going to say?
You can say yes, you can say no.
Yeah, no, I mean, having read Anne-Marie's chapter, this sort of experimental piece, I obviously thought it was great, and I was still am obviously very supportive of it, but like I say, it's so different from the way that we're taught. The sort of value in subjectivity is not really something that at least I've been taught. So I wonder if you kind of have to sit in that for a while before, like you say, Annmarie, like you've written so much about hospitals, and then you kind of shift to this uneasy space of seeing the value in your own subjective experience of writing. So I absolutely care about my writing, but I maybe don't actually care about it in the same way that you just described, David, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. David, do you want to tell us what you're working on, and if care has impacted it, and if so, how?
So I do work on a bunch of stuff, but the one in the last couple of years where the concept of care or care ethics has come up has been the Venice Biennale project. So I did it as a collaboration with Jennifer Thorogood and Tom Balaban from TBA Architects. It's wrapping up in a week, or wrapping down in a week. And then because of COVID, it got extended for an extra year. So there was a lot of things to take care of in that project in a way that you don't in writing about hospitals or something. That there were relationships to build with people. And right now, the project includes a kind of wrapping of the pavilion that's there. For some reason, the pavilion that we have, that's the Canada Pavilion in Venice, is an Italian architect's in the 1950s vision of Canada. So it kind of looks like a spiral teepee or something like that. And it was refurbished in just before we got a hold of it. So of course we covered it all up. That's what our project was. First thing we did, and that covering is now needs some care. It's been up since May, and it's a little tattered and a little needs some ironing and so on. So there's a kind of way that, because we didn't actually go and be on site, we didn't take care of it in a certain way. And so our gesture is kind of, kind of needing some care. But the other thing that happened in all of that is the 50 or 60 national curators, the curators of all of the national pavilions at the Biennale, just before, when COVID was going on and we weren't sure whether in 2020 whether it was going to open or not, Haewon Chung from the Korean pavilion convened us all on Zoom, or as many as people as she could get a hold of, and we decided to try to put pressure on the Biennale to postpone. And of course, we announced this day that we were going to do this, and so they had a press conference the week before and announced they were postponing. But from that, we started meeting every single month, and we had some subgroups that were doing other kinds of projects. And it really was about helping each other out and not competing. It was about, hey, is somebody going to be there? Can we borrow a hammer? What about this poster? And we're still an ongoing group. There's going to be events this weekend, not organized by the Biennale, but organized by this kind of self-organized, bottom-up group of people who made a kind of community because of the pandemic that has never, ever existed before. So there's never been a time before where the curators knew each other, met each other, talked to each other before it opened. And so right now we want to take care of that organization and see if we can pass it on to the next curators who are starting to assemble for the next version of the Biennale. So that's a kind of work that I don't normally get a chance to do. I'm more concerned with writing. That's not writing, that's trying to kind of organize and support what other people are doing in a really networked way. So that's, I don't know, I'd like to try to do that again with some people on something. It was spontaneous, so it's hard to make spontaneous happen, but maybe just even passing it on, if this kind of organization and community that we made, we can take care of and pass on, that would be great.
Mm-hmm. David, it just occurs to me while you talk that something that we both have experienced in our many years of writing about hospitals is collaborative writing with people in other fields.
Sure.
Like, in a way, when I started working on hospitals, I thought it was so intimidating and complicated that I had to, get a tuberculosis expert or whatever it was to write with, and you've done the same too. And I wonder if you think that kind of background in collaborative research facilitated this amazing caring environment that you're now interested in post Biennale.
It might. I think my favorite one was when we were with the Healthcare Technology in Place group at the University of Toronto, where we had a robotic heart surgeon, a fine artist who was making sculptures about hearts, a transplant team, an opera singer, and an astrophysicist, all kind of collaborating together. and I do think the whole idea was healthcare as a word. It wasn't just healthcare, it was care. And that was part of it. So that kind of collaborations and how you make them is it's not quite exciting, but I think it's just really important to nurture and hold on to and sustain when they can happen, when they're strong. So yes, and the collaborative writing, boy, writing with someone else can be really tough. But it just, when I was even younger, I used to work a little bit in theater, and that was the thing. You could never do what you wanted because there were so many people involved in making it. You always had to be part of something else. So I really like that about collaborative writing as well. I don't need to be in charge.
Annmarie, did you want to talk about your shift to teaching med students?
Well, I did mean to say something about that somewhere along the way tonight, and that is, when I was director of the school, and well, throughout my whole career, I've really believed that architecture has done itself a disservice by always arguing that as a member unit of the university, we're so distinct, the studio's distinct, we do different kinds of research, we have different kinds of hours. And in the end, it means you're alone in the university sandbox. And I think one of the things that medicine has done so beautifully is to make connections to the rest of the university. So anyway, I got an opportunity in 2016 to move my appointment to be a joint appointment in medicine. And I decided that this was an amazing opportunity to teach medical students about architecture. So I do that. I teach what's called a selective in Med 4, just called Medicine and Architecture. And I think that if more architectural educators had a chance to teach outside of schools of architecture, more people would value architecture, first of all, but they would also make wise architectural decisions in their careers. And most of the med students just say that they just see the world differently after my course, which is exactly the kind of thing that I want them to learn, to realize that there is this visual culture of medicine that makes a huge difference. So I'm teaching it again this March and really looking forward to it.
Yeah, I've always my experience is obviously more limited, but we were talking about my experience taking that course in oncology in
Yes.
The palliative care course in the oncology department at McGill. And I've been so surprised, and this seems, maybe you weren't surprised, but I've been so appreciative of how open folks outside of architecture are. They're so receptive and so excited about these questions of the built environment, and so eager, in my experience, to have these interdisciplinary conversations. And so it's just a matter of sort of making that happen.
Yeah, I hope it's going to happen more and more as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I am keeping an eye on the chat. I would encourage folks, we'll chat amongst ourselves, but I would encourage folks to take this opportunity to pick David and Annmarie's brains while we're here. If
One thing we were going to talk about, just while people are thinking about their questions, is these kind of new forms of writing that I think came out of COVID. At least they were new for me, that we got to write for eFlux, which has such a huge following. Because usually I write for these academic journals that have a very small readership. So that was pretty exciting to have 70,000 followers or whatever it was. And David and I gave a talk on eFlux too about hospitals in the city. But it's the first time I've really started writing for blogs, and Cynthia Hammond and I did this reconstruction of the Cormier Garden too that was so different for me, and it's just really great that staying at home meant that we got to think about new ways to work together and to produce different forms of publication. I know everyone else has been doing these things forever, but I really just got going last year.
Well, we're waiting for your TikTok channel to open.
Oh, well, actually, that's another thing I thought we might talk about, Fiona, is, I'm pretty addicted to social media.
Uh-huh.
And I still run or sort of backstage manage the School of Architecture's wildly popular Instagram channel, which has more than 20,000 followers. And I think one of the ways I connect to a pretty broad network in medicine is through Twitter. Like, it's just how I learn everything. So, I'm sorry that Donald Trump has ruined Twitter so much, but it's a very vibrant place where people talk about hospital architecture. And I know that's arguable, but anyway, it's one of the ways that I teach med students. Actually, we have an Instagram account, everyone who's ever taken my medical course. And I give out the password, and everywhere that they work in the world, they post photos. It's called just Medicine and Architecture, one word. So that's pretty fun.
We have a question here.
Whoa.
Yeah. Adrian, not to put you on the spot, but would you like to ask your question, or shall I parse through it here? I can go ahead.
It's fine, yeah, if you want to read it.
Sure. All right. So Foucault argued that modern institutions turn from a pre-modern paradigm of power based in taking life and letting live to making life and letting die. Your periodizations of the way hospitals represent a shift from care to cure illustrate something about Foucault's concept of biopolitics. At a surface level, it appears to be about the state's care for its citizens' lives, but it is a type of care which is entirely abstracted and statistical, a care for the molar body, and therefore entirely opposed to any form of attention to each individual's emotional life. This biopolitical form of care at a distance was also coincident with the building of state institutions, which ostensibly were public, and these institutions opened healthcare to a broad public. You suggest care has returned more recently, but given the way in which hospitals are now made through public-private processes, is care returning, or is this historical moment a regression that moves further from critical concepts of care? So I guess that's maybe for David first.
Oh, that's an Annmarie question.
You think?
Well, Foucault's not for me, but
Yeah, I think the P3 public-private process is part of it. In other words, the funding of how hospitals get made is indeed one of the things that we're starting to worry about in a different kind of way than we did before. Then what exactly Foucault had to say about hospitals and why that might be important to how we understand them today is, again, it's now a historical question. Foucault wrote that at a particular time about a particular kind of French hospital system that he was trying to understand and actively politically argue against and organize against. And I do think that the concept of care that we're dealing with today comes out of that same historical moment, but it was really a question of how does those hospitals, which, as you say, were ostensibly public, but how did they fit into communities, and how did they come out of communities, and how could you care for the community by building a hospital, for example, or how could you, if someone was in the hospital, how could the patient be the center of the organization rather than the doctors or the charity that came from the donors, let's say. But all of that gets pushed back by the incredible ability of medicine to cure people. In other words, there was an architecture of care associated with tuberculosis from, say, 1850 right until 1950, where if you had tuberculosis, the solution to that, the response to that was architecture. You had sun balconies, you had buildings that put you out in the sun, that gave you fresh air. And then suddenly antibiotics came along and they were just 200 times more effective, 1,000 times more effective than the architecture. So you were getting better care as a person if you got these drugs that medicine gave you than you were by this kind of community organization around caring for someone with tuberculosis. So that's a long answer to a long question, but there are parts to it. And the whole question right now is exactly as you say at the end: can we actually mobilize critical concepts of care, like Fiona is trying to do in writing about residential care? Can we actually shift how hospitals are organized and run and designed through the concept, a more critical concept of care than we had years ago? So does that rhyme, Fiona, with what you're up to? Are you trying to mobilize the concept of care? Or so I'm circling back to what Annmarie said at the beginning, where care might be a critical concept rather than a solution to some of those problems. We can analyze things with it.
Yeah, I think if I'm being honest, I originally, like during my master's, I was interested in care as a solution, but along the way, I am now seeing it more as a critical tool. And it's helpful that there just so happens to be in the last few years so much care talk and care, I was going to say care work, but I won't say that, work about care coming out, that like my perspective and the approach that I'm hoping to take has definitely changed a lot, just even in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, I think there's something all there together. Kind of dementia villages are also a kind of funding process as opposed to simply just an architectural one, right? We long-term care, anytime I've had the major time I had a tour of a long-term care facility was by somebody who was in charge of something like 20,000 long-term care beds as a property manager. That's a kind of Foucauldian scale of statistical, not individual care of that person. It's hard to imagine how you could be really careful about 20,000 people at once.
Mm-hmm. If I can just, while there's no other questions, if I can ask sort of a self-serving, I'm really interested, David, in your experience with the Curators Collaborative and sort of how, I don't know if you said the word refreshing, but I hear it as sort of a refreshing experience of having this space carved out to collaborate. And I'm reminded, I believe it was last week, Jennifer Chan in the talk in this series, she was talking about the moment that she realized, I think she said it was her first day in architecture school, where the professor said something like, look around, and everyone that you see, like none of these people will be architects. And she just had this moment of like, the profession is centered around ego and competition, and there just isn't room for everyone to work together. And I'm thinking specifically about our conversation we had the other day about sort of mental health and studio, and David, your comments about vocation versus profession, and how vocation might necessarily imply some degree of care. I just thought that distinction was really interesting, and I wondered if you might take a minute to explain it.
Well, I think we were just talking about this question that Annmarie raised about the competitiveness and staying up all night and never doing anything but architecture. So there's a way that it is good to care only about the thing that you're passionate about and to dedicate yourself to it. We normally think of that as a good thing. It's just, it flips over into this also obsessive, competitive, uncaring way. So a vocation where you have a calling, that's part of architectural's history, where lots of architects lots of famous architecture is not made by architects. It's made by somebody, or certainly not somebody whose primary way of earning a living comes from their doing of architecture. and it's just built into the evolution of the profession that there are these ways of dedication to the discipline that is quite separate from these other kinds of things that we're trying to do, caring about who's working in architecture and when they're doing it. Yeah, I often think about those. One of the people I was really interested in was Inigo Jones, 17th century architect, and he worked with a guy. Anyway, there many of the people that he was doing architecture with had a lot of money that didn't come from doing architecture. They were very rich, and they just simply collected books and built pavilions and did architecture, but not because they needed it to earn a living, but it was a calling. It was something that they could do that was important. And I think that remains in architecture culture, something like competitions, where people do competitions kind of for fun. It's work. You should get paid for doing architectural work. No lawyer kind of sits at home and does lawyerly work for fun and joins together with other lawyers just for fun and does the Venice Biennale. It just doesn't happen, but it is an important part of what architecture culture is at this point.
And I think a really good example from architecture school is when you're director, you get dozens of calls and emails for people who want students to do free work for them. Like, oh, I have this great daycare that your students could design. And so after a few years, I actually had this standard response. I mean, this is going to kind of sound snarky, but I said it in a very nice way that I'd say, thank you very much for the opportunity, but, you would never get a medical student to do your back surgery or a law student to work on your divorce. And you should, really hire a professional architect. And people are often shattered by that, but then they realize that, that's right. Why do I think an architecture student's going to do it for free? And I think we really need to be hyper aware of that.
Perfectly on time.
Okay, good.
7:30.
I just want to say that I love to iron too. David made the reference to ironing. And I am now old enough that I can admit publicly that I love to iron. And I think that shows a kind of interest in caring about something. Anyway.
I don't think I've ever ironed something in my life, but maybe I need to get into it, my new hobby. So I don't think there are any further questions that we've missed. I'm just double checking. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much, David and Annmarie, for chatting, and thank you again to the events committee and to the audience for your time and your questions.
Thank you, Fiona, for moderating, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight.
Thanks so much, Fiona, Annmarie, and David. That was really wonderful to have such a deep interrogation of the word care tonight. That was really helpful, I think, for us in our processes of thinking it through over the next few lectures and terms.